I can't.
Friends, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to get started now. Today's a very important and special event for Community Church of Boston. I mentioned last time our guest speaker today, Seyed Mohammad Marandi, spoke with us. I mentioned how the Community Church of Boston has a history, for example, in 1959, when W.E.B. Du Bois spoke at Community Church of Boston following a trip from the Soviet Union and from China. So the community church has a long history of going to places that are considered U.S. adversaries and listening to people from places that are considered U.S. adversaries so that we can enrich ourselves and educate ourselves and engage in dialogue and hopefully peace building. Our guest speaker today is Seyed Mohammad Marandi, who joined us from Iran at, as all of you know, a very significant time when a war just happened and there's the risk of war continuing. So I'm very grateful to be able to hear from our guest speaker today. Sayed Mohammad Marandi is a professor of English literature at the University of Tehran. He's also a very well-known and well sought after geopolitical analyst and commentator. He's probably one of the most in-demand speakers in the world right now on the subject of Iran. So we're very grateful to hear from him. And in the midst of his tireless efforts to bring the Iranian perspective to the West and to the rest of the world, he still finds the time and the patience to deal with somebody as ridiculous as Piers Morgan. So, Professor Morandi, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us again. I'm honored. It's always an honor to introduce you.
You're very kind. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm very grateful for the Community Church of Boston for giving me this honor to speak with your audience. I would just like to also add that the world that we live in today is very different from the world that we lived in just a decade ago. And events are taking place very swiftly. Changes are happening very quickly. And I think that it's very clear to people across the world that it's increasingly becoming a dangerous environment for all of us. So we all have to be more tuned in than ever before, and we have to be more proactive than before for the sake of people across the world.
Thank you. And I think that there's significant developments and changes that have happened just since you spoke with us in the end of January. So I look forward to discussing it further today. To begin, Professor, can you start by, because I know that many of our listeners right now, they receive their information from different sources and they may have different understandings of what has happened or what hasn't happened. Can you start by giving us, from your perspective, a description of the events that have occurred between Israel and Iran and the US since June 13th of this year?
The Iranians and the United States, after Trump took office, began a process of negotiations to ease tensions and to find a solution to the differences over the Iranian peaceful nuclear program. And the Iranians, despite the many grievances against the United States government, both under Trump uh, in the previous uh, period when he was in office, but also Biden, Obama, and uh, different US presidents that have been in office since the coup d'etat in 1953 that was carried out against the Iranian people by the United States and the UK. Despite all those grievances, the Iranians continued to negotiate. And so what happened was that while Iran and the United States were indirectly negotiating, uh, meaning that there were the Omani government officials who were mediating between the two sides, the United States began to conspire against Iran with the Israeli regime. So as at the beginning of the negotiations, Witkoff's position, and thus the Trump position, was that the United States has no problem with Iran enriching uranium at 3.67% for the sake of nuclear energy, for nuclear power plants to produce electricity. And I think that would have solved the problem. And the Iranians could have, for a period of time, discontinued enriching uranium at higher levels, so that there would be a more stable environment in West Asia, and so that peace and stability could be enhanced for the region, which is extremely important for the entire world because of its oil resources and its natural gas resources. But after a couple of weeks, Witkoff's position suddenly shifted, and he started demanding that Iran discontinue its nuclear program altogether, and or its enrichment program. And also other demands were being made by the United States, which were all illegal. They were all violations of Iranian sovereignty. And Iran is a fiercely independent country after the revolution in 1979. It is probably the most fiercely independent country in the world today. And therefore, sacrificing its sovereignty is not possible. It's not an option. Now, before I continue, I should point out that some may say, well, why does Iran need to be able to enrich nuclear material, to enrich its own uranium? The reason is that Iran is sanctioned. And so in all areas of the economy, the Iranians have a priority of being self-sufficient, because the United States tries to blockade Iran. It tries to bring down the economy, and Iran knows that if it's vulnerable in with regards to nuclear fuel, then its investments in nuclear power plants, which would be heavy because we already have one that functions, and we have a number of others that are being either built or designed. And as you all know, nuclear power plants are very expensive. The nuclear energy that comes from them is cheap, but the investment itself is very expensive. So if Iran builds nuclear power plants and then does not have the fuel, it will create an economic crisis, and billions of dollars will have been wasted. And ordinary Iranians would wonder why the Iranian government was foolish enough to build power plants, but not to ensure the security of fuel. So Iran needs to be able to produce its own nuclear fuel. And also Iran produces nuclear fuel at 20% as well. It uses fuel at the Tehran experimental reactor for cancer patients. And hundreds of thousands of patients every year benefit from these capabilities. Now, the reason why Iran enriches uranium at 60%, first of all, it's completely legal in accordance with international law, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But Iran does it basically as leverage, because the United States has sanctioned Iran. Maximum pressure sanctions are imposed, which target ordinary people, like in Cuba and elsewhere, where the United States uses maximum pressure sanctions. And Iran knows that the United States will never remove sanctions unless it's forced to do so. So in the case of Cuba, the United States will not remove sanctions. If Cuba had leverage, maybe things would be different. So 60% enriched uranium was leverage to put pressure on the United States to ease sanctions, and then Iran in return would discontinue producing enriched uranium at 60%. I've said that for years, and I've said that during the nuclear negotiations in Vienna, which were taking place 3 years ago in public. I've said it on the BBC Hard Talk. It's all there. There's no secret about this. So, but in any case, suddenly Witkoff's position changed, and the United States started making unacceptable demands. And then the night before the Israeli regime's attack, Trump said that he's against attacks. The next day, it was quite clear from his gloating that he knew all along what was happening. He was a part of it, and he had been conspiring through and deceiving Iranians, or trying to deceive Iranians at the same time through the negotiations, so that Iran uh, be caught unaware with their blitzkrieg attack. So what this has done, of course, is that it has destroyed any trust, if there ever was any, but it made things far worse uh, between Iran and the United States. In future, I think it's virtually impossible for Iran to have any deal with the United States, because Trump has shown himself to be devious, deceptive, dishonest, and someone who conspires even as he is negotiating. So I think that basically means that the next 3.5 years it will be almost impossible for Iran and the United States to come to any real agreement. But that remains to be seen. But in any case, ordinary Iranians are disgusted with the United States government. And according to polls, ordinary Iranians do not want the government to negotiate with the United States. That's thanks to Trump. So after the Israeli regime carried out this blitzkrieg attack, or even before it, we saw this very swift and sudden shift in the Western media against Iran. And the interesting thing was that it was not just conservative media like Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, the BBC, France 24, Deutsche Welle, all the entire media was suddenly demonizing Iran. I don't know if your audience saw this, but CNN kept on speaking about sleeper cells in the United States, Iranian sleeper cells. In other words, began demonizing Trump's opponents, began to demonize Iranians in the United States in order to help create hatred and fear towards Iran so that the United States could attack Iran. And that's something that we also saw elsewhere. Piers Morgan, that you alluded to, he began to suddenly attack Iran viciously and make up and fabricate all sorts of lies, basically within this this is all, if you look at why this was carried out and how all of this was done suddenly, it is clear that they were all preparing the grounds for aggression. And ordinary Iranians saw that. They saw that in the Western media. They saw that in the Persian language media that's broadcast from the West, broadcast by Western governments through, especially the United States, through funding, their government funding, how psychological warfare was being carried out against Iranians, and how, on the other hand, the Western media was trying to create fear among Western audiences, and especially the United States, in the United States. So during the blitzkrieg attack, the Israeli regime struck targets in Iran, and they murdered a lot of senior Iranian officials, military officials. But how did they do it? The Western media like to portray it as targeted assassinations, very sophisticated and very precise, and that it was an intelligence coup, which was not true. In fact, what they did was that they knew where these different generals lived, because they're not hiding anywhere. Public figures in Iran have homes, and people in their neighborhood know where they are. They would attack entire apartment blocks and massacre people in those apartment blocks to get a general. In one case, they brought down an entire apartment block, killing almost 70 people, including roughly 25 children, to murder 1 or 2 people. In another case, they murdered an Iranian nuclear scientist who had left his city of work, he went to the north of Iran to a town where his father lived. He stayed with his father, with his family. They destroyed that building, massacring the extended family in order to kill the scientist. In another attack, or numerous attacks, they would bomb apartment blocks and kill numerous families. If they couldn't bring down the entire building, they destroyed a number of apartments and killed the people in entire families inside those apartment buildings. So this is how they carried out the assault on day one. And later on, of course, there's footage that's come out, and I've tweeted one of them where they bombed simply one of the most very crowded areas. So the one that I tweeted was an airstrike on one of the most crowded and famous squares in Tehran. And you can see cars literally flying in the air, full of people. Children were leaving schools, going back home from school exams. And in that particular attack, large numbers of people were slaughtered. There was no military base, there was no intelligence base, there was no police station, there was nothing there, just innocent people who were slaughtered by the Israeli regime. But this is not the narrative that you'd hear in the Western media. So after this mass slaughter on day one, the Iranians quickly regrouped. The leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, put in new commanders to replace the ones whose lives were lost, who were martyred, and the Iranians regrouped and they began their counterstrikes against the Israeli regime. Now, in addition to the airstrikes, I should add on day one that the Israeli regime used large numbers of ISIS and Al Qaeda and Takfiri people, some of them Iranian and some of them refugees inside Iran. As many of you probably know, Iran has the highest number of refugees in the world compared to its population. We have millions of refugees, mostly from Afghanistan, and among them, but also among ordinary Iranians, the Israeli regime cultivated these people who would carry out attacks in Iran. So on day one in particular, there were large attacks carried out by these different remnants of ISIS and Al Qaeda and Takfiri people, as well as others too, both Iranian and non-Iranian. So, and of course, we know that ISIS and Al Qaeda and these Takfiri people, they've been used as tools by Western intelligence agencies since the 1970s. They began using extremists against the Soviet Union. And also in order for the Carter and Brzezinski used them to encourage the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan. But that's another story, and I digress. So after this sudden attack, where these ISIS and Al Qaeda and Takfiri terrorists, among others, they struck targets in Iran, especially radar systems. The Israeli Air Force carried out these massacres, and then the Iranians regrouped. And we saw that Iran began to strike back. And after a couple of days, the tide began to turn. And by the end of the war, we saw that the Israeli regime was in serious trouble. This is something that Steve Bannon has pointed out. He said that Trump literally saved the Israeli regime. And Trump himself a couple of times admitted that the regime had taken a bad battering, especially during the last 2-3 days of the war. And that's why they were the ones who sought a ceasefire. Now, one thing that I should add, which I think is very important, I think this is probably the most important thing that Americans should recognize. In the West, and in the United States in particular, for many years, so these so-called think tankers, or elites, the media, would constantly say Iran is weak, Iran is vulnerable. All we need to do is give it a push, and like a house of cards, it will come down. And how do they come up with these narratives? They hire so-called Iran experts. Many of them have never set foot in Iran. Some of them are Iranians who left Iran many years ago. Some of them, and of course, if you pay them well, they'll tell you what needs to be said. And so you had this narrative of a weak Iran, a vulnerable Iran, a so-called regime, as they like to call it, that is on the verge of collapse, that is imploding, that's hated by its people, and so on. And so these think tankers, they would get good funding, or these so-called Iranian academics at key universities would get excellent funding for projects. They would also bring in senators and congressmen and women to their conferences, give them huge honorariums, and then they get more funding, and everyone would be happy and wealthy as a result of this industry thriving. So this narrative was created in the United States and in the West, and the expectation was, because this attack was not about the nuclear program, it was about regime change, or it was about overthrowing the Islamic Republic of Iran. Why did they want to overthrow the Islamic Republic of Iran? It's very clear. Two reasons. One is Iran's independence, something that was never forgiven since 1979. And the second was that Iran is the only country that supports the Palestinian people, period, alongside Yemen. No other country supports the Palestinian people. No government anywhere. Anyone else who pretends to support the Palestinian people, they're making it up. It's all talk. In the case of Turkey, we see Erdogan doing business, transporting oil from Baku, cheap oil, doing trade, direct air flights, an embassy, the Emirates too, Jordan, Morocco, Qatar being in the pocket of the US government, has the permission to allow Al Jazeera to broadcast. None of these countries are there for the Palestinian people. So the United States want, and the Israeli regime want to end the support for the Palestinians. And if they are able to overthrow Iran, then I think it's very clear that that would be the end of the resistance against the Israeli regime as we know it. Now, the fact, though, the reality was that they killed large numbers of senior military officials. And they were almost all from the guards, the Revolutionary Guards, the so-called really evil people in the, as the American elites and media tries to portray them. But what happened? If one was to accept this narrative and the claims made by these so-called Iran experts, the so-called regime would collapse. But the exact opposite happened, as we knew would happen, as we'd always said would happen. And that is that people rallied behind the guards, the armed forces, the leader, the government, and demanded that Iran strike back. And we saw, as soon as Iranian missiles and drones were fired off against the Israeli regime, people came to the streets across the country under Israeli regime bombardment. And then in the middle of the war, there were national rallies in support of the armed forces on Friday, in the middle of the war, and huge crowds across the country participated, despite the fact that the Israeli regime was bombing people. So US predictions, Western predictions about Iran were completely flawed. And what actually happened was that the world saw that the Islamic Republic of Iran has popular support among its population. And in fact, that popular support has been strengthened by the behavior of Trump and the regime in Washington and Netanyahu. Because many young Iranians in particular, who've over the years been, especially in recent years, been influenced by the Persian media broadcast from the West, because many of these young Iranians did not see the revolution. They did not see how the US was supporting the Shah and his secret police. They didn't see how the Shah was gunning people down with US support on the streets of different cities in Iran, thousands of people dying as a result. They didn't see the United States supporting Saddam Hussein in the West, giving Saddam Hussein chemical weapons to use, as a result of which people even today are dying a slow death. These were young people who were born under sanctions, and many of them believed the Persian language media broadcasting from the West, BBC Persian, and a host of other media channels that were telling them that you're the most miserable people in the world, and that it is your regime's fault, as they like to say, that you are so miserable because your regime is stubborn. In fact, 3 years ago, when we had the riots in Iran, a bit over 3 years ago, over the color revolution under the name Women Life Freedom, or Woman Life Freedom, that was not about Mahsa Amini at all. In fact, a couple of days after her demise, footage came out showing that she had never been assaulted. And then the information came out that she had a brain tumor before, and the issue had nothing to do with violence. But many of these young people who came to the streets believed something much bigger, and they believed that their difficulties were because the Iranian government, the Iranian state, was stubborn, that it was not willing to solve the problems with the United States, that Iranian leaders were stuck in the past, and that they were sacrificing young people because they would not rethink their policies towards the United States and the West. And that created an animosity towards the Islamic Republic of Iran among a significant portion of the youth. I'm not saying a majority, but a significant portion. But what did Netanyahu and Trump do? What did MSNBC and Fox News both do together? They showed these young Iranians that the problem was never Iran, it was the United States. Iran, as it was negotiating, and in good faith, it was attacked by the United States and the Israeli regime, and the collective West supported this assault. The Europeans, even the liberal regimes in Europe, were saying that Israel has the right to defend itself. An unprovoked attack was carried out, and they said Israel has the right to defend itself. They bombed Iranian nuclear centers. Hypothetically, that could lead to radiation leaks, killing countless people. They supported that. The International Atomic Energy Agency refused to condemn it. These young people saw that worldview that the West so carefully constructed through their Persian language media shattered. And so many of my own students who were involved in, well, a number of my students, I didn't speak to two, but a number of my students who were involved in the protests, in the riots, or who were even on the streets at that time, sent me messages or spoke with me, basically saying we were wrong. And Ayatollah Khamenei was right all along, because everyone saw that Ayatollah Khamenei's suspicion, the fact that he was suspicious of the United States, his skepticism towards the United States was based upon sound evidence and a history of deceit by the government in Washington. And so what these people did was they strengthened Iran. So not only did ordinary people rally behind the armed forces, but also those young people who were cultivated by the West, they rallied behind the guards and the armed forces and the government and the leader. So This, I think, is the result of aggression, that the United States has only wrecked any possibility for future agreement because no one can trust them anymore. It never did trust them, but this mistrust has reached a new level, an unprecedented level. And two, they have united, the United States and the Israeli regime and the Europeans have united Iranians in a way in which I haven't seen since Saddam Hussein invaded Iran in my youth. One final point that I'd like to say, which is not directly linked, but I think it's significant. The International Atomic Energy Agency worked against Iran and issued an anti-Iranian statement was issued right before the Israeli regime attacked. This is something that everyone has to keep in mind. All of the international bodies that were constructed after the Second World War are Western dominated. We saw how the OPCW, which is for chemical and biological weapons, how it was used as a tool by the United States so that it could attack Syria. If you recall, the OPCW sent experts to Syria, into Douma, to see if the Syrian government actually carried out a chemical attack. And the evidence that they found, these experts from this organization, did not match with the claims. And these experts were saying that this is not an attack by the Syrian government. In fact, it was carried out by these al-Qaeda forces that were funded through Turkey, through Jordan, but especially Turkey. And of course, they had Western support and support from oil and gas-rich dictatorships, especially Qatar in the Persian Gulf. So what happened when these OPCW inspectors went back and started writing their report? They were sidelined. And then a political report was written. A very good journalist, Aaron Mate, has done work on this, and you can find his work on the Gray Zone website, which explains what exactly happened. The International Atomic Energy Agency plays the same role. It is a body that is controlled by the West. If you use AI, I use DeepSeek to search this. Out of the 35 board members, 17 are European and North American. That is almost half. And then South Korea and Japan are also board members. That gives them a clear majority. They had 20 votes against Iran. 19 of them were European, North American, Japan, South Korea, and the chainsaw man in Argentina, 20 votes. The rest of the world either voted against it or did not vote for this resolution. In other words, the overwhelming majority of the world population did not accept this, but they don't have the votes because these are not democratic bodies. The head of the organization is also someone who's in the pocket of the United States. The previous head, his name was Amano. He was Japanese. People can look this up. When he was a candidate to be the head of the this international body, the IAEA, he went and told the United States government that I will be with you on all issues. I will be your man if you choose me. If you check WikiLeaks, the documents are there. So if anyone has a question about why did the International Atomic Energy Agency take that position, that is the reason. Otherwise, the International Atomic Energy Agency has never claimed at any point in history that Iran was trying to produce a nuclear weapon. Not in the 1990s, not in since 9/11, and not now. Never. There's been no evidence provided that Iran's nuclear program has been anything but peaceful.
Did the IAEA provide sensitive information to the United States and Israel that was used to attack Iran?
Yes, that is another issue. The International Atomic Energy Agency has been using its experts to take information from Iran, and they pass on that information to Western intelligence agencies. And as a result, over the years, the Israeli regime has assassinated a number of our scientists. And during this war, they murdered a number of the scientists, a number of other scientists, nuclear scientists. In fact, the first scientist that was murdered by the Israeli regime with Western support, with US support in particular, was a colleague of mine at the University of Tehran. And he was murdered in front of his wife. And during the recent assaults, as I said, a number of these scientists were murdered with their families, with their wives and children, and in one case, their extended family, as that person was staying with his father at his father's house. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is in the pocket of the United States, as I said, if all you have to do is look at the WikiLeaks documents, has always been working with US intelligence. And when Iran's nuclear sites were being bombed by the Israeli regime and the United States, neither the head of this organization nor the organization itself condemned attacks on Iranian nuclear installations. They refused to condemn attacks. And in fact, members of the board, as I said earlier, Western regimes, they said that the Israeli regime has the right to defend itself, just like it's defending itself in Gaza and exterminating children, just like they exterminated thousands of children in Lebanon, just as they helped exterminate children in Syria through supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The Israeli regime has the right to defend itself in bombing Iranian civilian targets, including nuclear targets. And I should point out also that the three installations that in Isfahan, in Natanz and Fordo, that the American regime, the regime in Washington, and the regime in Tel Aviv bombed, all three of these installations are regularly inspected by International Atomic Energy Agency experts. All of them. Every part, every building, every place that's been bombed is under regular inspection. In other words, there's nothing there. But the United States and the Israeli regime give themselves the right to do what they want, and the Western media, by lying, by fabricating information, by fear-mongering, they justify it. So as I said, in the case of CNN, they talk about sleeper cells. Okay, well now, where are those sleeper cells? Where are they? They just go on to the next topic after they achieve their goals, they move on to something else. And the gullible audience that watches CNN or the BBC or Sky News or Fox News or MSNBC or ABC, NBC, CBS, they move on with mainstream media as well. Or they fabricate stories like they say that the Iranians want to wipe the Israeli regime off the face of the earth. Whereas the Iranian foreign policy towards the Israeli regime has always been very clear. All of these journalists know this, that Iran's position has always, since the beginning of the revolution, was that the Israeli regime must be dismantled like South Africa. But in the West, these journalists, who are some of them I know, they've spoken with me. Some of them have come to Tehran. Some of them have spoken to me on the phone. Some of them interact with me through email. Some of them interact with me online in different ways. I've explained this to many of them, but they will repeat the fabrications because that is a part of the agenda. They have to say that Iran wants to wipe Israel off the map to make it seem like Iran wants to build a nuclear weapon to slaughter Jews. That's basically what they're trying to do in order to justify war against Iran. And it doesn't, and this is the interesting thing that so many Iranians, especially young Iranians, saw, that it doesn't matter if it's Fox News or if it's MSNBC. In fact, going back to Syria, if you recall, and I think since your audience is politically aware, when Trump was elected the first time, he was Putin's puppet and a stooge for the Kremlin in the eyes of CNN and MSNBC and the mainstream media. But as soon as he started launching those missiles against Syria, suddenly everyone supported him. So when it comes to death and destruction and destroying other countries or countries that are not obedient to the United States, then all of those people who considered him to be a puppet or claimed that he was a puppet suddenly start cheering for him.
You mentioned, or you described for us how Iran was negotiating with the United States in good faith, and how this surprise attack on Iran destroyed trust and possibly ruined the potential for further negotiations. Was that one of the purposes of this attack, to end the negotiations and to further hostility between Iran and the US and Israel?
Without a doubt, the Zionist lobby and the neocons in the United States, they're the ones in charge. They're the ones who dictate US foreign policy. And they're the ones who pushed the United States towards war with Iran in order to prevent any form of rapprochement in future, and in order to create death and destruction, and to push the two countries towards a long-term war. There's no doubt about that. Those people who, Zionists and the neocons in the United States, they are not people who care for the interests of the United States. They care for the interests of the Israeli regime, first and foremost. And we see just how Trump himself has has been praising Netanyahu, this genocidal monster, who, as we speak, is slaughtering women and children. Every day he's slaughtering women and children. And over the past few weeks, as we all know, he has a new way of killing children and women and men. And that is drawing them into so-called zones where they have, or areas where they have aid, and then gunning them down. Bringing people into areas where they have food, and then gunning them down every single day. And you're not going to see this on CNN or Fox News. Every now and then there'll be something somewhere, just so that some of these media outlets could pretend that they have some sense of decency. But the reality is that Western media, they are controlled. It's controlled. It's no different from the Soviet Union of the 1980s or the 1970s or the 1960s. It's just more cleverly put together. The news and the way the information is. You'll see people having discussions on television. One says bomb the country, the other says sanction the country, the third says they're evil, but we have to find a different way. The narrative is always controlled, very well controlled. And if every now and then someone like me, after every few, it's very interesting. During the 12 days of war, we didn't have anyone from Iran on CNN or on MSNBC or on Fox News. On a couple of occasions, I was invited on Sky News. Once I didn't have an internet connection because they slowed it down due to the cyber attacks. But I'd never been on any Western mainstream media outlet during this period. You'd think that the evil side would have some, some voice, even token voice, but this is becoming increasingly one-sided. In the past, they would have token voices every now and then, but now even that's not really the case anymore. But of course, after Gaza, I think we should have zero expectations of Western media, mainstream media, legacy media, and our only hopes can be pinned on people in the alternative media and activists, mostly young. They're the ones who I think have been creating awareness. Young university students, young people across the West and across the world, Jews, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, all of them, I think they're the ones who are the driving force that are bringing about huge change in perceptions about the role of the Zionist lobby and the neocons.
You and others have made the point that these attacks on Iran, the war on Iran, it's not about the nuclear program, it's about regime change in Iran. And I accept that. However, the so-called mainstream media here, we're constantly bombarded with all this viewpoints and propaganda that Iran is on the verge of a nuclear weapon, Iran wants a nuclear weapon. However, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, he issued a fatwa saying nuclear weapons are against Islam. And you and others have argued that for many years, many decades, Iran has not even wanted a nuclear weapon. Can you address that point? Does Iran actually want a nuclear weapon? And also, the United States and Israel, by such provocative, obscene attacks on Iran, aren't they incentivizing Iran to want a nuclear weapon?
Well, actually, to begin with the last point that you mentioned, if you ask Iranians today, should we have a nuclear weapon? If you go on the streets, overwhelmingly, they'll say yes. We need a nuclear weapon. In fact, there is sharp criticism right now towards the government, towards the state, that they because they're not pursuing nuclear weapons. Ordinary people are saying if we had nuclear weapons, Trump wouldn't dare attack us. Netanyahu wouldn't dare slaughter people. Europeans wouldn't dare support the slaughter of ordinary Iranians and the attack on peaceful nuclear centers, which could, again, hypothetically, bring about radioactive contamination to cities across central Iran. But I have to go back a bit here and to give my own personal example, which I may have actually done last time round. But I'm growing old, so I'm forgetful, and you'll have to forgive me. In the 1980s, the United States and the Europeans, they supported Saddam Hussein in his invasion of Iran. They encouraged the invasion, and they provided him with everything he needed. And the Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf, they provided the funding. So these regimes that were in the US camp, they provided the funding, and Western regimes provided the capabilities, along with the Soviet Union. But the West had a particularly ugly role. And one thing that happened, one of the evil policies of the West was to give Saddam Hussein chemical weapons. And which country was the key country in the development of chemical weapons in Iraq? It was Germany. Germany, with its history in the Second World War, was in charge of helping Saddam Hussein gas Iranians, gas Iraqis. In one instance, he gassed the town of Halabja, a town full of women and children, and murdered 6,500 people instantly. What did the United States do? What did the Europeans do? They did not condemn him. There was no condemnation whatsoever. They continued to provide him with chemical weapons. And they blocked the condemnation of Iraq in the UN Security Council. I have a personal experience because I survived 2 chemical attacks. During the Khaybar operations, I think in 1982, the Iranian calendar is a bit different from the American calendar. It's different, but I think it would be in 1982 in the American in the Western calendar that I survived a nerve agent, and in 1988 I survived mustard gas. And interestingly, the West, as they were providing chemical weapons to Saddam and biological weapons, he was beginning to develop them with their help. But they also gave him the military intelligence to carry out those attacks and the political cover, of course, to get away with it. Whereas Western governments were preventing Iran from purchasing gas masks That's how sinister they are. Yet, at that time, when Saddam was using, and remember later on, only after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and he did not use chemical weapons in Kuwait, did suddenly the United States, CNN, Western media, back then CNN was a thing, the US President Bush at that time, the father, started talking about chemical weapons. They did not say who gave Saddam those chemical weapons. They gave it to him. But I digress. So, senior politicians and military officials went to the leader at that time, Imam Khomeini, and said, we need to produce chemical weapons. And Iran has the infrastructure because it has petrochemical power, petrochemical plants, it has refineries, it has knowledge for this sort of thing. It had it back then. He said no. He said, under no circumstances can you produce or use chemical weapons because it is inhumane. So this is, I think, key evidence to show that even in war, Iran refused to use chemical or produce even chemical weapons. The Americans have been, and Netanyahu in particular, Netanyahu, the first time he claimed that Iran was producing nuclear weapons was 1992, I think. And he said Iran will develop nuclear weapons in 3 to 5 years. 1992. Ever since then, he's been saying that Iran will develop, again, you can use DeepSeek or some other AI right now as I'm speaking to check this. Fact checkers. You will see that since 1992, he has been saying regularly that Iran is about to develop nuclear weapons in 2 years, in 3 years, in a few months, in a few weeks, for well over 3 decades. And the Western media will repeat whatever he says. They will not tell you that he's been saying it for 32 years. And Iran has, even though the American U.S. intelligence has been saying regularly, including Tulsi Gabbard, have been saying that Iran is not pursuing nuclear weapons, and they say that Iran hasn't been doing so since 2003, even though Iran was not developing nuclear weapons before 2003. But let's leave that aside. Since 2003, even the regime in Washington admits Iran has not been pursuing nuclear weapons. All of this, as I said, is used as tools against Iran. If it's not nuclear weapons, it's terrorism, it's human rights, it's missiles, it's a space program. They will use whatever they can to undermine Iran because of Iran's independence and because of Iran's support for Palestine. Those are the real issues. Otherwise, how in the world could the West and its regional allies that have been complicit in the Persian Gulf and across the region in the Holocaust in Gaza, how can any of them ever have the audacity to speak to Iran and Iranians about human rights? An unprecedented genocide in human history where people are being exterminated in front of the eyes of the world. In the past, we'd hear about genocide. We'd hear about different holocausts or massacres across the world in our history books or school books, maybe a picture or two, black and white, it's a couple of people, and they tell us that millions died when Japan invaded China or when Germany invaded Eastern Europe or when the conquistadors went to Latin America or the plunder of Africa. We'd read it, or in South Asia. We'd read about it, but never in human history is there a case where people are being exterminated in front of the eyes of the world for almost 2 years, in front of the Western media. The Western media tries to explain it away and justify it. And those who protest are punished. And those who criticize are marginalized. and day and night these people are being massacred in the West, would have the audacity to speak about human rights to anyone. They have no right to speak about human rights to North Korea, let alone the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the only country which has the moral strength to stand up and say no to genocide and pay the price and be willing to pay the price. But in any case, what the United States has done is that it has pushed ordinary Iranians and Iranian public opinion towards strong support for developing a nuclear weapon. Ordinary Iranians want a nuclear weapon. So Trump, all he has done over the years is that he's been trying to push Iran to produce nuclear weapons. Now, Iran has always been opposed to nuclear weapons for two reasons. One is what I already explained. Iran has always been against weapons of mass destruction, as we saw in the 1980s. But there's a second reason. That is that if Iran produces a nuclear weapon, which it can do that, it can do it right now. It has been able to do that for over 2 decades. Producing a nuclear weapon is not that difficult. But what the Iranians are fearful of also is that that would just encourage other countries across Central Asia, the Caucasus, West Asia, to seek nuclear weapons. And many of these are unstable regimes, family dictatorships. All the Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf are inherently unstable family dictatorships, from the Emirates to Kuwait, Azerbaijan, and elsewhere. You see regimes that may be stable today, but since they do not have, since they're bound to certain families, they are inherently unstable. And so tomorrow we may have regimes that have nuclear weapons that may think about using them. So Iran does not want nuclear weapons for these reasons. But ordinary people are now telling the government that the United States is threatening us. The Israeli regime, which has nuclear weapons and is carrying out a Holocaust in Gaza, should be deterred from thinking about nuclear weapons. This is the argument that's being made in Iran. And all of these arguments are strengthened because of Trump, the neocons, the Zionists, and the likes of Netanyahu.
I think it's remarkable how Iran has resisted the pressure to build a nuclear weapon in the face of such aggression. And I think it's a testament to their commitment to their principles, which I admire very much. Professor, you mentioned how these attacks on Iran have unified Iranian people across generations, across ethnic groups, across religious and secular communities. So if the goal of Israel and the US was to do regime change in Iran, hasn't that goal backfired by their actions actually unifying and strengthening Iran?
Yes, I would say that without a doubt, Iran today, at this moment, is significantly stronger than Iran was 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, before the strikes. And that says a lot. Despite the slaughter of senior military officials, and of course, so many innocent people, ordinary Iranians came to the streets and rallied behind the armed forces and the guards in particular, because those commanders were the focus of these assaults, those commanders and their children and grandchildren. That showed Iran's strength to the world. And then those who were influenced by Western narratives during recent years, especially many young people, some of them my own students, I would argue that my faculty at the University of Tehran is among the most liberal in the entire country, and at the University of Tehran, because my students, since childhood, many of them, they've been studying foreign languages. And in the case of my students, they've been studying English. Many of them are as fluent as I am, if not more fluent, in English. They brought up with American TV or American websites or American movies or American music and American culture, or British maybe, or Canadian or Australian. Many of them know more about Western culture than they know about Iranian culture. Many of them have been fascinated by the West. Many of them have been supportive of the West, as I explained earlier. They believe these narratives. Because my faculty, as I said, my department is the English department at the University of Tehran. You have to get a very high national score in the national exam to get into my faculty. Yeah, my students from day one when they enter the University of Tehran, they're very fluent already in English. They already know, as 18-year-olds, they're very well informed about Western societies, or at least they're informed from the mainstream Western perspective, not so much so from alternative media, not so much so from the critiques. They know American history not through Howard Zinn, but they know it through documentaries made by mainstream Western media or through movies produced by Hollywood. They know that version of America. So these young people have suddenly, and I'm not saying that most young people fell into that camp, but a significant number of young people were in that camp. Those young people, as I said, their worldviews have been completely shattered. And they recognize now that Ayatollah Khamenei, and before him Ayatollah Khomeini, were right all along in their skepticism, and that they were not being unreasonable or hard-headed, but that they believe that the United States is not capable of being honest. And that is largely due to the fact that these elites in the United States believe in American exceptionalism. The United States is, in their view, exceptional. It has special rights and privileges. And if you have special rights and privileges, then you don't need to abide by commitments because you're above those commitments. The other side must abide. In a sense, American exceptionalism is not very dissimilar to Zionism, a chosen people, a master class, a master group of people with exceptional rights, more human than others. So when Palestinians are slaughtered, they are less valuable. And those who know better have a reason for doing this. The Americans who believe in American exceptionalism believe that the United States is also some sort of special country where God gave it the authority to do whatever it wants to other countries. And if it slaughters millions of people, it can be a mistake, but it's never a criminal regime. So if you've noticed, whenever they speak about the Iraq War, they never say that the United States committed crimes. They say it was a mistake. It was a mistake to destroy a country. It was a mistake to kill 1 million people. That was a policy mistake. But for everyone else, if anything much smaller, if a government kills 10 people somewhere or violates human rights, the West gives itself the authority to overthrow it, to destroy it, to attack it, to bomb it. Not for those reasons, but for other reasons. That would be the excuse. But in the case of the United States and the Europeans or the Israeli regime, they can do whatever they like, but since they are superior to the rest of humanity, what they do are not crimes. They are at most mistakes.
it's often communicated to us that Israel, with the support of the US, has some of the most advanced, sophisticated air defense in the world. Can you spend some time commenting for us how effective or ineffective Iranian missiles were at penetrating Israeli air defense, and how effective or ineffective the Israeli and US air defense was at stopping Iranian missiles?
Well, first I have to apologize because I sometimes see messages on my screen as I'm speaking, but I'm not that smart. So while I'm speaking, I can't read. I can't figure out what there's, especially when I see a lot of, and then it quickly disappears, so I don't have the time to read them. And if I'm not addressing any comments that are being made, it's because I just couldn't read them. So I apologize. I'm not ignoring anyone intentionally. Yes, I think one of the interesting things is that this country, Iran, which has been under so many sanctions, has been able to create a missile and drone capability that has basically defeated the Israeli regime, but not the Israeli regime so much as the United States and the entire NATO and regional collaborators. So what happens is that Turkey, countries in the Persian Gulf, all of them have radar systems that are controlled by the United States. These radar systems are used to help the Israelis defend themselves and used to help the Israelis carry out assaults on Iran. Jordanian airspace is used by Western governments and the Israeli regime, the Air Force of each of these regimes, these governments. And I say regime because they call Iran a regime, so I always use the same terminology for Western governments. But they used Jordanian airspace to defend Israel. So you see this regional, I called it a year and a half ago, this axis of assistance. And I still consider them to be an axis of assistance, whether it's in Turkey or it's in the Emirates or in Qatar or in Jordan. They assist the Israeli regime, whether in the genocide or in its assault on Yemen or in Lebanon or against Iran. So regional countries have been collaborating with indirectly and helping the Israeli regime. In fact, just recently, Tucker Carlson on one of his shows said that the air base in Doha, Qatar, the CENTCOM Forward Command Center, was made to protect Israel. And the Qataris pay for it. They not only give them the land, they pay for all their expenses in Qatar. So the facade aside, they're all in the American camp. The rhetoric is just empty words. And those who think that, by supporting these governments, that they are somehow supporting the Palestinian people, they're just fooling themselves. But in any case, it's not only them. The entire NATO has been trying to help the Israeli regime defend itself against Iranian missiles. And the United States has stationed ships along in the Mediterranean. And that the air defense capabilities inside Palestine. And the Air Force of the British and the French and the Americans, they've all been working together to help. All of this combined, this coalition of 50, let's say, countries, NATO, Europe, and regional countries, have been unable to block Iranian missiles and drones from striking the heart of the regime. And that, I think, shows how sophisticated and smart young Iranian engineers are. That the empire and its collaborators combined have been unable to stop this single country from defending itself against this Israeli regime that they have helped in its aggression. And what has ultimately led to the ceasefire was Iran's ability to punish the Israeli regime. And it only now is information gradually coming out that these strikes were terribly damaging. Ali Abu Nima, who of Electronic Intifada. Although I think his family name is pronounced differently in Arabic, but I think that's how it's pronounced in English. Um, he was saying a while back on a show that he was in Jordan when the missiles were striking. He said he heard the explosion of a missile from 150 miles away, kilometers away. Maybe he said miles, I don't know, from Amman. That's how devastating these missiles were. And this was in response to aggression. And this was despite the efforts of the entire empire and their collaborators and their proxies and their allies to block Iran from striking back. And if it wasn't for Iran's capabilities, does anyone think for a moment that the Netanyahu regime would have discontinued attacking Iran? They would have, as we speak, they would have been bombing Iran with Western support, with the support of these dictatorships in the Persian Gulf. Who will not lift a finger for the people for the children of Gaza and elsewhere across West Asia, who do not lift a finger for the children of Gaza. Instead, they send fuel to Netanyahu to fuel his genocide.
I'd like to give you two questions. One is that I was listening yesterday or the day before to Scott Ritter, and he was saying that this 12-day war and the missile exchange, that within that, the missiles that Iran fired at Israel, those were Iran's older missiles and they're less sophisticated missiles. And they're more advanced, more sophisticated, newer missiles, they didn't even touch. That's what he said.
That's,
So that was my first question. Do you agree with that? And my second,
yes, absolutely. And not only has Iran left untouched its more advanced missiles, but it's also left untouched its more advanced drones. So Iran has been holding those, and there are many thousands of them, missiles and many thousands of drones that are kept just for Palestine. In other words, those missiles and drones that are focused on the Persian Gulf region in case of war with the United States are a different set of uh, drones and missiles. They are short range and medium range. And they are actually much more effective because the accuracy of short and medium range missiles and drones is much greater, and they reach their targets much swifter. So those underground bases are a whole different world, and they have nothing to do with Iran's strikes against the Israeli regime. So yes, basically Iran has left all of its newer generations of weapons untouched for the next round.
and my follow-up
And
question,
even Iran with its older capabilities has been able to go right through these multi-layered defense systems that were brought together by all sorts of countries alongside the Israeli regime. The heavy lifting of air defense is done by the United States, not by the Israeli regime.
and what is the financial cost to Iran to produce these missiles? And what is the financial cost to the US and Israel for the air defense?
It's 15 times more expensive for them to bring down missiles or drones than it is for Iran to produce and launch them. So if they bring down a drone, they lose. If they fail to bring it down, they still lose. It's lose-lose for them because making these drones and missiles for Iran is very inexpensive, comparatively speaking. But for the United States to produce the anti-missile missiles or the anti-drone missiles, it's much more expensive. But the reason why they do it is because there's a huge profit in this for the military-industrial complex, for those who are linked to these companies that produce them. So they may not be uh, useful in the sense that they don't they cost much more than the missiles that are fired or the drones that are fired. But the money goes into the pockets of people, and that's more than enough for the U.S. government.
Professor, I know we're approaching our time here and we're going a little over. You've been very generous and we still have so many questions. If I could just ask you a few more questions. We have a comment and a question here in the chat that I'd like to read to you. It's from Mr. Alan Perez, who's the Vice President of Community Church of Boston. Mr. Perez writes, Professor Marandi, I am grateful to you for exposing the facts. From Mexico to Argentina to Chile, your voice has been heard. Thanks to you, we now have a deeper understanding of your heroic country. You have our solidarity with you and your people. One question, what might be the role of Azerbaijan in this conflict?
The government in Baku has a very close relationship with the Israeli regime, and it and Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, they have been collaborating with Israel in exporting cheap fuel from Azerbaijan to the Israeli regime during the last 21 months. This has not stopped even for a day. In fact, in the case of Turkey, when Ansarullah blocked the Red Sea to Israeli shipping, Turkey helped the Israeli, through its exports, helped the Israelis make up for some of those losses. So Erdogan, despite the rhetoric, he has been very helpful to Netanyahu. And his sidekick, Aliyev in Azerbaijan, he is even worse because he purchases much of the country's military hardware from the Israeli regime. He's intentionally creating a special relationship with that regime. And Israeli drones have been, according to eyewitnesses, ordinary Iranians near the border. They would fly from Iraq immediately. They'd move alongside the Turkish border and go swiftly into the Republic of Azerbaijan airspace, use that airspace for protection, and then attack Iran from the north. People close to the border have been saying this. As towns bombed near the border were witnessing the death of children, the death of women, the death of families, the death of innocent Iranians in Tabriz, as well as in other cities in the north and the northwest. People were witnessing drones flying into Iran from the Republic of Azerbaijan and flowing from the Caspian Sea, of course, from the Republic of Azerbaijan into Iranian airspace from the north. And this is something that if the Iranians do not want war, Iran has kept the peace in the Persian Gulf region, as we saw. But this is not going to be tolerated if it continues. And the Republic of Azerbaijan is another one of those family dictatorships that is very vulnerable. And if it continues to go down this road, it could have very devastating consequences.
We were supposed to have an event yesterday with Ambassador Chaz Freeman, which we have to reschedule because a storm took out his electricity and his internet connection. But when I was speaking with him on the phone yesterday, he knew we were doing this event with you today, Professor. And first of all, he wanted me to give you his regards. Secondly, I asked him, is there any questions or topics that he would suggest to me to ask you? And he gave me a list. Some of them I've already asked you, but these next couple of questions I want to ask you, they come from Mr. Chaz Freeman. One of them is, what do you, this ceasefire, this so-called ceasefire between Israel and Iran, can you comment on, from your perspective, how was that arranged? Was Iran promised anything? Or was Iran following up on a previously stated position of theirs that if Israel stopped attacking them, they would stop attacking Israel?
Well, first of all, Chaz Freeman is a unique person who I admire greatly. And if someone like him was advising the United States government, or people like him were advising the United States government, we would be living in a very different world, a much safer world, where countries would rather do business with the United States. And if it was some people like Chaz were influential in the United States, the Iranian-US relationship would be completely different from what it is today. And of course, I send my greetings to him as well, and to all of our friends across the United States and across the world who hear us. I don't know the details. Obviously, I'm not privy to behind the scenes negotiations or anything like that. My understanding is that a request was made from the other side, and that the Iranians agreed to halt. It wasn't a ceasefire. The Iranians have not accepted a ceasefire. They would say halt in a cessation of hostilities. And the Iranians agreed that after a certain time, it would no longer strike the regime. But during the last 3 hours before the halt in hostilities, the Iranians carried out heavy missile strikes against the regime in order to make sure it understood where the power lies. Now, it has been said, and I do not have information about this, but I can say what some people say, and that is that, and it may not be true, that the United States has promised the Iranians that something will be done for Gaza and for Lebanon, and that through the communications that took place, such promises were made. Whether that is true or not, whether it is linked to the ceasefire negotiations that we see today, whether it's linked to this or not, I really don't know. But time will tell. But in any case, the Iranians did not want they do not want the region to go up in smoke. They do not want a regional war. They do not want to bring the global economy to a halt. Because if there is a regional war, that would mean that it wouldn't mean just oil no longer passing through the Strait of Hormuz. It would mean oil and gas no longer leaving anywhere in West Asia and the Caucasus. It would be a catastrophe that for the entire world that would be far worse than the 1930s. That's not what Iran wants. What Iran wants is an end to the genocide in Gaza. Of course, ultimately what Iran wants is the dismantlement of the apartheid regime. Once an American journalist asked me, what would you want this country to be called? I said, I don't care. You can call it Palestine. You can call it Israel. You can call it, I don't remember what I said. You can call it Chinatown. You can call it Disneyland. Doesn't matter. But ethno-supremacism, ethnic cleansing, genocide, all this must come to an end. That is what Iran wants. And it's extraordinary how such simple demands are depicted as so ugly and inhumane and evil. So Iran is evil. It wants to slaughter everyone in Israel simply because Iran says ethno-supremacism is unacceptable. It's quite simple what Iran is saying, but Western media, they will run with this narrative of genocide as they are supporting genocide. It's unbelievable.
I'll ask you two more questions and then we'll get ready to close the program with a very short reading. This next question also comes from the ambassador, which, by the way, I just want to mention, he was also praising you he was praising you a lot, and he said that you speak with such an elegance and calmness that he's not sure he would be able to do if he was Iranian in these circumstances. So I just wanted to mention that for our audience. Ambassador Freeman also suggested that I ask you that, have you participated in discussions with people internationally who are not Americans? And how has their perception and viewpoint been in regards to this 12-day war?
Well, again, I'd like to thank the ambassador for his kindness. Well, personally, I have been in contact with people from across the world because I've been very active during this period. And in general, I've been active on media, especially alternative media like your own format. And I must say that ever since the genocide in Gaza began, the mood across the world and the view towards Iran has changed fundamentally. And especially over the last few weeks, I've seen how people across the world have just recognized how all these Western narratives for the last 45 years are just nonsense. And so many people see Iran as the hope confronting great evil. And I find this to be quite stunning because for so many years I've been trying to convince people that we're not as evil as you say. But now I have to sometimes tell people, well, I support the Islamic Republic of Iran, definitely, but it's no utopia. We have many problems here too. So it is amazing how the actions of the Israeli regime, the Zionist neocons, how they've changed views across the world and how they have also brought about such an awakening in the West itself, where some of the most effective anti-Zionist commentators and journalists and scholars are Jews who are heroically speaking out against the regime and pointing out that this has nothing to do with Judaism. And of course, Christians too. And I think that young woman at MIT, I think she was probably of Hindu origin. So you see how the world has changed, and people from all across the world and from all walks of life and from all sorts of cultural and religious backgrounds are reaching new conclusions. And so, yes, the view towards Iran has changed, and but also in a more, let's say, at a government level, you do see countries across the global south growing closer towards Iran. It's clear as day that other countries are also fearful of what the United States and the Israeli regime could do in future by tearing up the UN Charter. The UN Charter and the UN and all these bodies that I alluded to before, these were created for Western domination to enforce US hegemony. But ironically, the West is destroying these very same institutions that they themselves created as they become increasingly irrational in the way in which they try to preserve their dying empire. So countries across the world and across Asia in particular, BRICS countries, they are concerned, and that has caused powerful countries to tilt closer towards Iran as a result.
I'll ask you one more question before we get ready to wrap up the program. But first, I want to read a comment from the chat. Virginia writes, I apologize for my country's role in the suffering of the people of Iran due to US foreign policy. I share that comment because I think that's a sentiment shared by many of the listeners on the call right now. And I'll also add to that, not just Iran, but also Gaza and Palestine and elsewhere. I think the last question, Professor, I want to ask you before I give you the final words is, can you comment on the situation in Gaza generally? And can you comment more specifically? You alluded to this earlier, but can you comment more specifically on this so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which it appears day by day it's backed by Israel and the US. It seems like they're another tool being used to further the genocide of Gaza in a very brutal way, killing desperate and starving Palestinians. who are seeking food for their family. Can you talk about this, please?
Well, first of all, there's no need for those who are standing up to genocide and standing against genocide to apologize. Those who are raising awareness, those who are making sacrifices, those who are standing up against this catastrophe and crime of our time, of our era, they are all to be celebrated. Every person across the world who is standing up against this, against ethno-supremacism and genocide, they are heroes. Whether they have American passports, or whether they have South African passports, or whether they have Indian passports or Chinese passports, doesn't matter. They are all heroes. Those who have to apologize are those who are silent. And those who are complicit, I have nothing to say for them. The genocide in Gaza, the Holocaust in Gaza is ongoing. And I think we all know more than enough. But what is important is that we must not allow focus to be moved away from Gaza, even if there is a ceasefire in the coming days or weeks. Our focus must remain on Gaza. What the Israeli regime has done with the support of the entire West, and even with the support of regional countries through trade and business, and even when Yemen was standing up against the Israeli regime, it was Qatari the airbase in Qatar and countries in the Persian Gulf whose facilities were used by the Americans to bomb Yemen. So our focus must remain on Gaza. We've seen all sorts of crimes committed against the people of Gaza. Crimes that you'd only see in the most ridiculous and outrageous Hollywood movies, where the antagonist is so unbelievably sinister that that it made the movie unbelievable. But the Israeli regime has gone beyond even the most sinister antagonists in Hollywood movies. You see pictures of people walking, and then these drone pilots, these disgusting and sick people, would just bomb these people with their drones just for fun and pleasure. You would see them bringing people systematically every day to places to get aid, and then they gun them down every single day. And the Western media does not want to talk about it. They do not want you to know about it. Every now and then something will be said, and then they move on, just to keep appearances, just to have people think that they have some sort of credibility, that they have even the slightest amount of integrity. This is the crime of our era. But Iran and the axis of resistance cannot accept this. It is unacceptable to us. And Iran will continue to support Palestine. It will continue to support Gaza by any means necessary. And it does so. That is why they're able to resist even today, despite all the odds. How Iran helps, I have no idea. How it gets supplies in there, I don't know. But of course, all that tunnel infrastructure and all those capabilities, the assistance back then continues, I assume, in the same way and form that it did in the past. But the axis of resistance, whether in Lebanon, will continue to try to draw energy away from Gaza. Lebanon made huge sacrifices for Gaza. It's quite extraordinary how Lebanon has sacrificed so much, the resistance in Lebanon, for another people. The sacrifices that the resistance has made, thousands of martyrs, was to help the people of Gaza. In Yemen, the sacrifices were made for another people, not their own, to stop the genocide in Gaza. And the same is true in Iran. And one reason why the West miscalculates is that they do not understand the culture of this axis of resistance. Tonight is, in the Iranian calendar, is the 9th of the month of Muharram, in the first month of the lunar year. We call it today, we call it Tasu'ah. Tomorrow is the day of Ashura, the 10th of Muharram. The grandson of the Prophet, on tomorrow, he went at the request of the people in Iraq, in Kufa in particular, to help them against the oppressor of his era, the dispossessed, the marginalized. They asked him to go. And even though he was told by many that they are an unfaithful people, and he knew that, he went because they asked him to. And on his way there, a famous poet told him that the people of that area, that region, their hearts are with you, but their swords are against you. And he said, I know. And he went with his companions and his household. And in Karbala, the land of Karbala, he stood against this army of the despot of that era, Yazid. And in that army, there were thousands of people who had written to him to come to their aid. But they were forced to switch sides. Their hearts were with him, but their swords were against him. But he refused humiliation because he was given a choice to submit or to be killed. And he and all of his companions refused. And there was a famous statement that in Iran is always repeated right now in Iran, across the country, in different gatherings, people are saying, Hayhat min nadhillah, never to humiliation. We are the furthest away from humiliation. After he and his companions were killed tomorrow, his sister, another grandchild of the Prophet, Zainab, she was captured along with the family of Hussein, Imam Hussein, Hussein ibn Ali, and the families of his companions who were martyred. And she gave speech after speech under threat, and as she was prisoner, and raised awareness fearlessly against the despot and his henchmen, because they went there to support the disenfranchised and the marginalized. This chapter in history is very, very influential in Iranian culture and across this axis of resistance. It is deeply embedded in our ideology. And Christians in Iran, tonight we have a healthy Christian population. Christians in Iran tonight celebrate this act of defiance and this act of sacrifice carried out by Imam Hussein and his companions, his sister, and those who were with him. This is a part of our ideology. It is a part of our culture. It is deeply embedded in our beliefs. Even the most secular of secular people in Iran, and of course secularism means different things to different people, but even the most secular, on tomorrow and tonight, they're on the streets. This is something that the West does not understand. We will not forsake the Palestinian people and the people of Gaza. This is why Iran will not do a deal with the empire and close its eyes to what goes on in Palestine. Because these people are calling for help, and we have been helping them for decades. That is why we are sanctioned. That is why they try to strangle us. That is why they attack us. That is why they slaughtered so many people in Lebanon and Yemen, because they refuse to close their eyes to what goes on in Palestine. And so, if anyone wants to understand why we resist, they have to go and look and read about Imam Hussein and his sister Zainab, and they will understand why it is impossible for us to betray the people of Palestine.
Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing that. When I was at the mosque last night and the Imam was speaking about the 9th of Muharram, the 10th of Muharram, and the 11th of Muharram, and the day of Ashura that we remember, he was saying that one of the themes of these days that's important for us to remember in our history and our theology is this theme of the oppressed standing up to the oppressor and supporting those who are oppressed. So I feel very grateful to be able to speak to you today and to be able to listen to you today. And also, I just want to share my own opinion that this is my opinion that right now I believe that the Iran, along with Ansar Allah in Yemen and southern Lebanon, I believe these are the leaders of the Muslim world right now because they're the ones exemplifying Islamic values of courage, bravery, justice, steadfastness, and they're using these Islamic values to stand up to the bullies, Israel and the United States. So that's why I think Iran is the leader of the Muslim world right now. On that note, I want to close.
I would add one point here, and that is that today, all of us are the resistance. I remember at the beginning of this genocide, there were protests across the world, but for some reason, I remember this woman who would stand alone in front of the Israeli embassy in Seoul. I don't even remember her face. I just remember that there was a Korean woman who would stand in front of the embassy of the regime every day and protest. Today, we see that the resistance has grown so large. And it's because of those people who stood steadfast back then in small numbers everywhere. And they created awareness. And those who joined them created further awareness. And today, the entire world is waking up to the reality. So we are all a part of the resistance against genocide, against ethno-supremacism. No country is perfect, but we all are recognizing what is the most ugly of all. And that is what the Zionists and the neocons and those who support this injustice and this evilness, what they are doing. And we see the resistance, as I said earlier, among Jews, among Hindus, among Muslims, among Christians, among people from all walks of life and across the world. And that is something that for me creates optimism. Despite the darkness of our time, and this darkness may increase, but I think that this is the light at the end of the tunnel, which helps us remain hopeful for humanity. And of course, ultimately for all of us, our hope is and faith is in God. But this humanity that we see today growing, and despite all the threats, this is something that I think should give us all hope for humanity and for the future.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, everyone who's listening, also for your time and your interest. If you want to hear more of Professor Marandi, you can follow him on social media, and he's on your favorite podcast very regularly. So all you need to do is search his name. I'm going to close today's program now with a very quick reading. This is from the Quran, and it's chapter 31. I read from verse or ayat 16. And it says, and Luqman continued, my son, if even the weight of a mustard seed were hidden in a rock or anywhere in the heavens or earth, God would bring it to light, for he is all subtle and all aware. Keep up the prayer, my son. Command what is right, forbid what is wrong. Bear anything that happens to you steadfastly. These are the things to be aspired to. Do not turn your nose up at people, nor walk about the place arrogantly, for God does not love arrogant or boastful people. Go at a moderate pace and lower your voice, for the ugliest of all voices is the voice of a donkey. That's from the Quran. Thank you again, everyone, very much, especially Professor Marandi. Thank you. Have a great day or great night, depending on where you're listening from.